All right, here I am finishing up the comparison between Louis XIV and Peter the Great. Okay, back to these notes. Reign of P, Louis XIV, Peter the Great. We've covered Louis's control over religion, the army, and the economy through his economic advisor, Colbert, along with the definition of mercantilism and ways that countries practice mercantilism. And this is, use this for mercantilism about the way that the British control their colonies, or the way that the French control their colonies, two of the biggest colonial practicers of mercantilism in Europe during this period of time. Okay. The nobles for Louis XIV, there was a revolt when he was a boy. Where can I put this? I'm just going to write it underneath nobles. The Fronde, Fronde, was a noble revolt when he was a boy. However, he is able to take control over the nobles, and not just through this better bureaucracy of laws, collecting taxes, and justice and police. He's able to do it through arts and architecture. And Louis XIV's long-lasting contribution to art and architecture is the Palace of Versailles. And this is in also the context of the style of the time, which is Baroque art. Baroque, which, as we saw before, it's not just practiced by the Catholic Church, it's also practiced by monarchs, and especially Catholic monarchs during this time. And it's blockbuster, large works of art and sculpture, and also architecture. It's extremely ornate, meaning lots of decoration over the top. If you're thinking of an example of modern Baroque, it's lots of gold, it's lots of marble, statues glorifying himself. It's not so different than putting your name in gold on a building like our current president does, except here, Louis XIV, he put suns on his building at Versailles because he was known as the Sun King, which really drives home his idea of having a divine right, and also the sun's rays as seeing and being all-encompassing, and rays over his whole kingdom of control. And he's able to keep the nobles at Versailles. He has the nobles move there, and he controls the nobles through being at Versailles. And so with these ridiculous ceremonies like the levee ceremony, just him getting up in the morning and having different people having the honor of putting on the king's shirt, or the king washing the king's hands, things like that. And it's all part of his control over nobles by keeping them close. With peasants, let's just say that if you have control over religion, the church, and if you have control over the nobles, and if you have control over the economy, then you control the peasants. And so the peasants are controlled by the nobles who control the peasants. So if you control the nobles who control the peasants, then you control the peasants too. And so nobles and also peasants are forced into the army as well. And the nobles are following the king, so therefore the king controls the peasants. So that's what I'll just say about that one. But mostly the nobles and the church, if you control both of those, then their control over the spiritual and the physical lives of its people, you can control the majority of your people if you control the nobles and the church. All right, we're going to go to Peter the Great now. His control over religion. He instead of having, instead of the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and instead of being controlled by a pope, a single person, Peter the Great changes it from one person to a council. So he makes it a council of religious leaders who have to report to him. And that's it was called the Holy Synod. And so they all report to Peter the Great. And Peter actually was great, a hulking, huge person, almost 7 feet tall. And so he is able to break up. He has control over the church by making it a council of religious leaders instead of a single leader. And they report to him, the Holy Synod. And again, that's Eastern Orthodox. So when Peter's a young man, a teenager, he takes a trip to Europe. And he's especially amazed by what he sees in France and what he sees in the Netherlands. He wants to make Russia more technologically advanced, and he does so through brutal means and with his extreme power. For example, with the army, he forces peasants to join for life for basically 25 years, which is pretty much a life sentence. Peasants to join army for 25 years. And he also has them trained by Europeans, by Prussians especially. And Prussia was basically an army with a kingdom, was the joke they said about it, because the Prussians were such a militaristic place. And so it was trained by Prussian officers. And he also uses his army to take territory. And so he fights in the Great Northern War against Sweden. Great Northern War to expand Russia's borders. In fighting the Great Northern War versus Sweden, he's able to capture a piece of extremely valuable property, and that is on the Baltic Sea. He needs a port that is on Europe. Before, his only port in Russia was Archangel, which is at the top of Russia, and it freezes over. But he's able to capture land that he then turns into his own city that becomes a port city or a window over Europe, and he names it St. Petersburg, the city. And it's tied to the army in the way that he fights Sweden to get the territory to build St. Petersburg. All right, the economy. He also enacts mercantilist policies of encouraging manufacturing and exporting. However, feudalism persists as well, and he finds a way to collect taxes through bureaucracies where he has control over the nobles. And so by getting control over the nobles, he's able to get control over the economy through taxes. Okay. And then for the nobles, he radically changes the nobles. He does it both socially and politically. And so socially, he cuts their beards. He wants them to appear more Western. Cuts beards. He cuts their sleeves off of their traditional long robes that nobles had. So he wants them to appear to look more European rather than Russian. And so he forces this, and he would take nobles and cut their beards off himself. And so that's a social way. He also forced them to move to St. Petersburg and had forced them to use their own serfs, their peasants, to build it too. To St. Petersburg. This is a guy who, again, when it comes to absolute monarchs, he does not get people's consent. He is a domineering bully, and he bullies his nobles, and by doing that, the one thing he does let nobles keep, or they're able to keep serfs. And the nobility in Russia, they control, some of them have such huge populations of serfs that they control. It's tens of thousands of people. And so if he can control the nobles, he also can control the serfs, the peasants or the serfs in Russia. Oh yeah, another name for Russian nobility. They're called boyars, or just another name for a Russian noble, a boyar. All right. And then again, his big contribution to arts and architecture is St. Petersburg, this city that, of course, he names after himself, right? Petersburg, Peter City. And he forces nobles to move there. He forces peasants to go there. It was on a swampland, and suddenly, within a relatively short amount of time, it becomes a major city. And he builds palaces and canals and glorifies himself there on St. Petersburg, and now has a way to get to the rest of Europe through a year-long warm water port. And so, and again, with the peasants, he controls nobles, so therefore he controls the peasants. He also controls the church, so therefore he controls the peasants. And so you can see these are different aspects of Louis and Peter. And I remember in class, I think many of you said that you ended up saying that Peter the Great actually was more absolutist than Louis XIV. And some of you said that Louis XIV was more absolutist than Peter the Great. And I guess my question is going to be, which one had more absolutism than the other? And explain why. Okay, so you're comparing, does one have more control over nobles than another? Does one have more control of peasants over the other? Does one have more control of religion than the other? And so come up with some comparisons. All right. Thank you. That's it.